Here we are rebuilding the components of the Nissan RE5R05E transmission. Now, this particular transmission has suffered a transmission cooler fault. In other words, what happened was the automatic transmission's oil cooler, which is actually part of the radiator, has failed. And so antifreeze and water has entered the transmission, and transmission fluid has been forced into the automotive cooling system, into the antifreeze and water mixture there within the radiator. Now, apparently this probably took place possibly over a couple of years, and what happens is the automatic transmission now has failed. All of the rubber has swollen and deteriorated, so what I've done is I've gone through, disassembled the transmission completely, and washed it thoroughly in solvent. And I'm using a Safety Clean commercial solvent machines, and this happens to be the 150. That's the flash point. That's what Safety Clean calls it, the 150 solvent. It means it's flash point. In other words, a point that it goes from a liquid to a vapor is approximately 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we're going to start out by rebuilding the pump. I've already disassembled and washed it. Let's take a look at critical components and critical areas. What I'm looking for is wear of the pump face, and this is actually in excellent condition. This pump is indeed serviceable. And as we go over here, this is the aluminum pump cover, and here's the actual pump body. This is made out of a cast iron material, or cast steel I should say, considerably harder than iron. And as we can see, it is in excellent condition. Very, very little scoring. Let's take a look. Here are the actual pump gears. We want to pay close attention to the orientation as I assemble it. This side is down, this side is up, and I can actually look at the witness mark. This is where the converter hub has been bearing against the pump to drive it. And of course, looking at from the back, it would be turning counterclockwise from the front clockwise. Now, the steps in rebuilding the pump start out with, of course, obviously a thorough cleaning, careful inspection, and now the rebuild. Obviously, we're replacing our O-ring seals, which come in the kit. We'll be replacing the front seal, and we'll also be replacing this bushing. Okay, here we see our pump body. After careful inspection, this is certainly in excellent condition. This is from a 2005, and as we mentioned, this is the RE5R05E. First thing I need to do is remove the seal. Now, there are all kinds of methods, and some people have their own. This is one of my little favorites, the adapter case. They call it a pry stick. It has all different types of uses. It's actually used for snap rings in the case, but I notice it does a very nice job of lifting the seal out without damaging the housing. Now, the trick is I need to remove this bushing, and this is pretty tricky. Now, what I'm going to be doing, this is actually a proto, and we can call it a bushing cutter, and that's what I'll call this. Here we have a similar design, and this is actually a snap-on. But the idea is I'm going to use this to carefully drive the bushing from the housing. Here we go. When removing the bushing there from the pump housing, the idea is to use the bushing cutter and get between the bushing and the housing. Try not to make contact with the housing, but just push on the bushing. And oftentimes helps, if you can see the bushing seam, is to actually attempt to cut the bushing or remove the bushing at the seam. Now, what we're going to be doing here is we'll be using an arbor press to actually press the bushing in. You notice that I'm using an aluminum driver, so this will not mar the bushing or the cast steel housing. Here we see the bushing carefully pressed into the pump housing. Now some bushings require staking. We always use an arbor press. A hammer is usually a very bad choice. So here an arbor press with a precision bushing driver. So it's actually pressed in, and then of course we must test it on the converter hub. Make sure, now of course this is the remanufactured converter that's going to go into the vehicle, and it fits smoothly. Might have liked it just a hair tighter, but this is just fine. Nice fresh bushing. There we go. Now the next step is the seal. Okay, here we see the pump housing. Nice fresh seal, pressed in with an arbor press. New bushing, pressed in and then staked and then carefully tested on the converter hub. Especially if you stake the bushing, you've got to make sure that you burnish the bushing by just simply slapping it with the rubber mallet or Carpathane hammer and make sure that it moves smoothly there on the hub of the converter. Okay, here we're ready to continue the assembly of our pump. You'll notice there are clear marks that indicate the upward facing side of the outer pump member. The inner facing side, this step part goes down towards the torque converter. And here you can clearly see the witness mark where the converter hub has been bearing against the pump drive gear, or drive member I should say. Now, obviously when I put this pump together, it would help me because it's going to start up rather abruptly as I start the engine. So I'll go ahead, and we've inspected it carefully. The pump housing is in excellent condition. This is a 2005 with more than 100,000 miles on it. So just a little bit of assembly lube. And just very gently slip this together. We're clear as the up and down side here of our pump gear. Now we have a new O-ring, and this goes around this part of the pump, and we want to make sure and lubricate it thoroughly. Now this is transmission assembly lube. This is the Smart Blend. This is the blue. Find it works very nicely both in summer and winter. Now, what I'm going to do here is, this is just a transmission fluid. It's not really seal conditioner, it's just transmission fluid. So what we're going to do is put a little bit of this here, just so when the pump starts up, she doesn't start up dry. A little lubricant on the bushing, and we're ready to put it together. Okay, here we have the pump. So we replaced the seal, the pump bushing, went ahead and inspected the driving and driven member of the pump. They look in excellent condition. Replaced the O-ring on the cast iron section and a fresh O-ring on the aluminum section. We carefully torqued our 6mm Allen bolts, and of course remember the spec on that's going to be relatively low. These are small bolts, so usually the spec is going to be matching the type of fastener. And what we're doing is we're just sliding it down. Got to get through that stator support here. I don't think we've even touched the bushing yet, coming down into the torque converter. Good. Okay, here we have the pump, all carefully put together. New front seal, new bushing, O-ring on the cast iron member, fresh O-ring on the aluminum cover. Here we carefully torqued our 6mm bolts. Keep in mind that the torque spec is relatively small. These are small diameter metric threads. I'm going to make sure it turns smoothly. I've actually have a little bit of assembly lube and transmission fluid there within the pump so it's not starting up dry, and make sure that it slips nicely there on the converter hub. No problem. Okay, here we're ready to continue the assembly process. We rebuilt the pump. Now I'm going to go ahead and start putting the transmission together. And as we put it together, you want to have a good understanding of where thrust bearings go. This is a thrust bearing race, and you'll notice that after 100,000 miles, I see a witness mark of where the rollers have actually been riding. This looks to be in excellent condition. So we'll go ahead and put that on there. Okay, here we see the forward sun gear, and it's going to be prevented from turning counterclockwise by a sprag clutch and clockwise by a band. Now, what I'm going to do is go ahead and put this together. This has been carefully washed. Now, on some of these thrust washers, or I should say thrust bearings, this is actually a Torrington thrust bearing. We just use a little bit of Simile lube, glue it in position. We've inspected the sprag clutch carefully. Now, if we're actually looking at it from the front of the transmission, the lockup direction is obviously going to be, quote, counterclockwise, and the unlock direction is clockwise with engine rotation. Of course, when I look at it at the back, obviously that's reversed. But in operation, the sprag clutch will lock it in one direction. If I apply the band, it locks in both directions. Okay, and here we see our next thrust bearing. Now, normally what happens when you're looking at these thrust bearings, and I actually have a chart that shows me the correct orientation, and sometimes it's a little confusing on the RE5R05E, but normally if you have an inner race with a lip, that's going to fit around the hub portion. And this is a captured bearing. This one does not come apart. Some do. They just snap right apart. You could probably snap this one apart, but it's unnecessary. We'll go ahead and set that in position. So here, sprag clutch is freewheeling in the correct direction. I guess they use the term lock to the clock here, looking at it from this direction. Okay, here, this is the input clutch. Now, we have a clad piston where it actually has the seal is part of the piston. We have a brand new one, and we have the D-type sealing rings on the piston itself, and I have a type of diaphragm return spring. Now I'm going to take this over to my arbor press, and I have an adapter that's going to gently push this down, and I'm going to use a set of snap ring pliers to remove the snap ring and take this apart. Okay, here we see the input clutch assembly, and in our overhaul kit we have the new Torlon hook type sealing rings, which will be replacing these. And whatever you do, do not forget the O-ring here for the turbine shaft there as it goes into the torque converter assembly. This is for the torque converter clutch, and of course this is the last thing that goes on after I assemble the transmission. All right, here we see the piston, the spring pockets, and the return spring. Here's the spring retainer, and what happens is actually lubrication pressure is directed to this section, and so what this piston is actually doing is it acts as a return piston. Centrifugal force will hurl fluid to the outside and is of course captured by this lip seal, and it helps return the piston. Now, anytime I have a spinning clutch, we're going to have to worry about that. So many late model transmissions, they actually have a method where they either have a dedicated pressure or use simply lubrication pressure to fill a cavity to counteract the effect of centrifugal force on fluid trapped on the apply side. Now, because this transmission fluid was contaminated with antifreeze, you can see that the seal has swollen and softened. Now you'll notice that this O-ring pick is made out of plastic, not steel. And so, hey, I can stab the D-type sealing ring, you can see, and pull it right out, but I don't have to worry about marring the aluminum. And I see a little discoloration there as a result of the antifreeze behind the seal, but that should wash out without any problem. All right, so these are, of course, going to be replaced. This is part of our banner kit, which will include all of the frictions and all of the rubber. And also I have a piston kit, so I'm going to be getting a new return piston.